What if I told you that in 2016, Russia was just a few blunders away from violently overthrowing a European government? It was election day in the tiny Balkan country of Montenegro, home of the world's tallest men, and the setting of James Bond's Casino Royale. On that day, a secret plot had just been thwarted. Late that evening, Montenegro's Prime Minister, Milo Djukanovic, announced that the country's special services had just arrested 20 Serb citizens. He claimed that they had been planning a paramilitary coup to throw the country into chaos and potentially to assassinate him. From the outside, the story sounded borderline cartoonish. In fact, it was so outlandish that much of the world didn't believe it was real. According to the Prime Minister, the alleged plot involved members of the coup infiltrating parliament dressed as fake policemen, staging a false flag attack on the protesters, and installing a pro-Russian government. Global media barely registered this as news. It seemed like the kind of wild conspiracy theory that authoritarian leaders sometimes invent to discredit their own opposition. Many observers, including opposition figures in the country, laughed at the government allegations, suspecting Djukanovic, who was fighting corruption charges at the time, had faked a false flag coup himself to make himself popular again. It was a typical he said, she said situation. But 8 days later, something happened that started to make the story sound less absurd. Serbian police arrested 2 Russian citizens. They were found in possession of counterfeit Montenegrin police uniforms, 122,000 euros in cash, and sophisticated encrypted communications equipment. It was clear that they weren't just tourists. But who were they? And what were they doing there? My team was determined to find out. Hi, I'm Christo Files, an investigative journalist who has spent years exposing Russian intelligence operations across Europe. This is the latest episode of our ongoing series on Russia's Unit 29Y55, the covert military unit specializing in sabotage, assassinations, and political destabilization missions. If you've been following this series, you know that we've already uncovered how the unit was behind the Skripal poisonings in Salisbury, England, the attempted murder of a Bulgarian arms dealer, Emilian Gebrev, and the coordinated campaign to blow up munition depots across NATO territories. But those were just a few of the unit's operations in recent years. Today I'm going to tell you the story of how our joint team at Bellingcat and The Insider at the time uncovered Unit 29Y55's role in what almost was one of the most brazen operations of Russian interference in European politics since the Cold War, an attempted coup in Montenegro designed to prevent the country from joining NATO. Now, back in 2016, when this coup attempt took place, I was just beginning to investigate Russian intelligence operations. But as I investigated more and more cases, I not only became aware of what Russian military intelligence, the so-called GRU, was capable of and how far they would go. I also began to develop a sense of who the key players were, what the actual agents were, what the military units comprised and how they operated, and where their main headquarters were located. And these were critical ingredients to cracking this case. But before we get into how we uncovered the truth, let's discuss some important political context about Montenegro in 2016. Since gaining independence from Serbia in 2006, 10 years earlier, this small Balkan nation of just 620,000 people had been walking a tightrope between East and West. And then in 2015, the Montenegro government made a decisive choice, supported by much of the population. They decided to join NATO. As we've seen repeatedly across Eastern Europe, any country's movement toward Western institutions triggers an almost reflexive response from Moscow. Montenegro was no exception. In December 2015, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov had explicitly threatened Montenegro with quote-unquote retaliatory measures if it proceeded with joining NATO. The Russian parliament threatened to freeze all cooperation projects with the small Balkan country if it did so. Montenegro, for its part, largely ignored these warnings. In May 2016, Prime Minister Djukanovic signed an accession protocol with NATO, depriving Russia of a potential ally with naval access to the Mediterranean, very important for Russia. The Russian response escalated quickly. On July 14, 2016, Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson of the Russian Foreign Ministry, tweeted, "The current Montenegro authorities will bear full responsibility for the consequences of their anti-Russian stance." Just 3 months later, on election day, we began to see what she may have meant. Now, back to October 16, 2016. On that day, Montenegro was holding parliamentary elections. As polls closed that evening, Prime Minister Djukanovic made an extraordinary announcement. His special services had just foiled a terrorist plot. According to Montenegro's chief special prosecutor, the plot was elaborate and could have been deadly, involving dozens of conspirators. The first step of the plot would have been for the conspirators to blend into the crowds of opposition protesters gathering just outside the parliament building on the night of the elections. Then a politician from the opposition Democratic Front, an anti-NATO, pro-Russian alliance, would take the stage and trigger both the crowd and hidden terrorists to storm the parliamentary building by force. The conspirators planned to occupy the building for 48 hours and proclaim a new transitional government. During this chaos, shooters positioned in the crowd would assassinate Prime Minister Djukanovic. Altogether, investigators later suggested that there had been around 50 armed and trained men planning to be in attendance and supplied with a large cache of rifles and pistols. The ultimate endgame was to change Montenegro's political course and prevent its NATO accession, steering the country back towards Moscow. But here's what made the story incredible. Prosecutors claimed that this wasn't just a domestic plot. This was a Russian operation, a Russian infiltration, they alleged. Serbian and Montenegrin conspirators had been organized by Kremlin-backed operatives. When these allegations were published, the international reaction was initially skeptical. At that point, Prime Minister Milo Djukanovic's party had already won the elections. The story seemed too outlandish and perfectly timed to reinforce the ruling party on election day. Many observers suspected that this was political theater designed to discredit the opposition. But that skepticism only lasted 8 days, when 2 Russian operatives were arrested in neighboring Serbia. For my team at Bellingcat, when we started reading about these developments, the equation completely changed and we knew we needed to start digging in. There was hard evidence of Russian involvement in what appeared to be a genuine conspiracy to destabilize a NATO candidate country. And maybe, just maybe, we could identify these 2 Russian men who had just been arrested. Our investigation began with the limited information Montenegro had released about the 2 men. They were identified only by their cover fake names, Eduard Chirokov and Vladimir Popov. Montenegro had issued Interpol notices, red notices similar to international wanted posters for both men, so we had their passport photos, birth dates, and claimed places of birth. And then on February 19, even more helpful information was released. Montenegro's special prosecutor announced that Eduard Chirokov was actually an alias. The man's real name was Eduard Shishmakov, a tip provided to them by Polish intelligence services. This was very revealing. It validated that we were really dealing with a Russian agent, a state-issued false document, and aliases are typically reserved for active intelligence operatives. The special prosecutor announcement also revealed more to us about Edward Shishmakov's background. Shishmakov wasn't some freelance mercenary or nationalist extremist. He was a career GRU officer with an extensive military and intelligence background. Born in 1971 into an army officer's family, Shishmakov had finished secondary school at a Soviet military base in Halle, East Germany. In 1993, he graduated with distinction from the Black Sea Military Navy Institute in Sevastopol. Following Navy school, he studied at the Military Diplomatic Academy at the Russian Defense Ministry, a training institution for military attachés and for GRU intelligence officers that would be expected to operate under diplomatic cover. But one thing in Shishmakov's past was particularly significant. In 2013, he began serving as naval military attaché at the Russian embassy in Warsaw. And in November 2014, less than 2 years before the Montenegro plot, he had been expelled from the country, from Poland, and declared persona non grata. The charge? Espionage. Polish counterintelligence had caught Shishmakov red-handed, recruiting a Polish lieutenant colonel who worked for the Ministry of Defense in that country. According to court records, Shishmakov had tasked the officer with providing data on hundreds of Polish military personnel with history of misdemeanors or disciplinary issues. They would be considered the easiest targets for their recruitment as informants or spies for Russia. The Polish lieutenant colonel received 17,000 zloty, about €5,500, and was given an encrypted phone to communicate with Shishmakov. At the same time, a Polish-Russian lawyer named Stanislav SZ, full name was never disclosed, was arrested for economic espionage in Poland. Polish media revealed that Stanislav was apparently handled by the same GRU officer as the lieutenant colonel, presumably Eduard Shishmakov. So Shishmakov's background clearly confirmed that he wasn't just a Russian national, an average Russian tourist. He was a recently burned GRU operative with a track record of recruiting assets in NATO countries, using encrypted communication devices and targeting individuals with compromised backgrounds. And now he had turned up in Serbia days after the attempted coup in Montenegro. Now, the second Russian, Vladimir Popov, proved much more challenging for us to identify. Montenegro prosecutors knew him only by that fake cover identity, and we had to work our way backward from limited information. His passport photo, his claimed birth date of June 29, 1980, the supposed birthplace in Kurganska Oblast in Russia, and the fact that he had been traveling alongside other confirmed GRU agents. Our investigation into Popov began with a working hypothesis that this was also an alias. We confirmed this by checking Russian databases and finding that while someone with this name and birth date existed in records, there were no earlier reference to this individual in databases we consulted. The entry listed only one passport issued in 2009 and was associated with a Moscow address. When we contacted the family listed at that Moscow address, they never had heard of Vladimir Popov. This random assignment of a residential address was a pattern that we had observed previously with other undercover GRU operatives in the past. The breakthrough came when we searched Moscow vehicle ownership databases. In a 2011 version of a leaked Russian traffic police database, we found that someone named Vladimir Popov owned a Kia Ceed. More importantly, his registration showed 10 unpaid speeding tickets, 4 of which were concentrated near a specific GRU address at Moscow's Khoroshevskoye Chaussee 76B, that's the GRU headquarters building. We then used a technique that had helped us identify other GRU operatives. We searched Moscow databases using only the first name and patronymic Vladimir Nikolaevich and the actual birth date of June 29, 1980, while leaving the last name blank as a wildcard. In Russia, the father's name, the patronymic, usually always falls between the first and the last name. In that same 2011 Moscow vehicle registration database, we found only one matching entry, Vladimir Nikolaevich Moiseev, listed as the owner of a Subaru Legacy Outback. This person had a passport issued by the Tyumen region in Russia and was registered at an address we recognized, Matryoshka Tishina 10, Military Unit 48427. Military Unit 48427 is a GRU airborne Spetsnaz reconnaissance unit that had played critical roles in the two Chechen wars and in the 2008 Russia-Georgia war. If Moiseev was assigned to this unit before 2008, he would have participated in Russia's military operations in Georgia. Further database searches confirmed our theory. We found Moiseev registered at the Tyumen Military Engineering Institute in 2004 and 2005, and in residential databases for Kurganska Oblast with a registered address in the tiny village of Pivkino, exactly matching the birthplace listed on Popov's fake birth records. The smoking gun came in a more recent vehicle database. Vladimir Nikolaevich Moiseev was listed as owning a 2015 Subaru Outback with a contact telephone number identical to the number listed for Vladimir Popov in the earlier Kia car registration. This database also revealed that Moiseev's current address was in the same apartment complex where Alexander Mishkin, one of the Skripal poisoning suspects, had been given an apartment by the state. Both apartments were registered in their wives' names through similar arrangements, transfer of ownership directly from the city of Moscow to the officers' families, unencumbered by any mortgages or payments. We could now confidently say that Vladimir Nikolaevich Moiseev was the true identity for the second Russian arrested in Serbia. And like the Skripal suspects, he maintained two parallel identities in Russian databases, his real name for domestic purposes and his cover identity Popov for international operations. But our investigation didn't stop because we had just confirmed that these two men were both GRU officers. We wanted to understand how the plot had unfolded and what evidence supported Montenegro's claim that they were trying to overthrow the government and maybe kill the prime minister. The prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony from two self-confessed conspirators who had become informants for the police. Alexander Sinjelic, a Serbian former convict and paramilitary leader, and Mirko Velimorovic, a Montenegrin national who had surrendered to police just a few days before the election. Sinjelic's story provided a detailed account of how the Russians had recruited him. According to his testimony, he had first encountered some Russian nationalists while fighting alongside separatists in eastern Ukraine in 2014 and 2015. These contacts invited him to Moscow one day to meet with representatives of the special services, as he was told. On September 26, 2016, Sinjelic claimed he met with Shirokov as he knew him, and Moiseev, Popov as he knew him, in what he described a luxury apartment in Moscow. During this meeting, Shirokov showed Sinjelic a detailed architectural plan of Montenegro's parliament building and outlined the plan for entry and takeover on election night. Shirokov then ordered Sinjelic to buy weapons and ammunition, providing initial funding in cash and later through Western Union transfers. Upon returning to Belgrade, Sinjelic contacted Velimorovic to procure weapons from Kosovo and rent a safe house in Podgorica. Travel records show that Moiseev, using the name Popov, arrived in Serbia on September 29, while Shishmakov, traveling as Shirokov, came a few days later on October 2nd. There, they provided encrypted Lenovo telephones with pre-programmed numbers to Sinjelic, who passed one of them to Velimorovic. According to Montenegro police sources, allegedly leaked to Montenegrin media, these phones had been purchased online from a Bulgarian website. The Montenegrin prosecutors had released these two testimonies to the public, which became key for our investigation. First, we felt that we had to verify Sinjelic's claims. To do that, we began by examining his social media activity, which provided compelling circumstantial evidence. His VK, the Russian social network equivalent to Facebook, had a profile showing that he had been a vocal opponent to NATO, the EU, the West, since at least 2013. His feed was filled with Russian-manufactured anti-US, anti-Ukraine, and anti-EU propaganda, along with posts showing his admiration for Vladimir Putin, for example. More significantly, we analyzed the timing of the social media posts. Sinjelic was normally an active poster, averaging 7 to 8 posts per week. But on September 25, 2016, the day before the alleged meeting in Moscow, he posted a selfie from an unknown location. After this post, Sinjelic went completely silent on social media for 4 weeks until October 20, 2016, when he reposted a generic pro-Russian message. This 4-week gap was highly inconsistent with his prior online behavior, but perfectly consistent with someone working on a project that required intense focus, travel, and minimal digital footprints. The most compelling evidence came from leaked audio recordings obtained by Montenegrin media. On October 19, 2016, several news outlets published transcripts and audio of alleged phone calls between the conspirators made on the day before the election. In one call between Sinjelic and Velimorovic expressed concern about not receiving clear instructions for the following day. Voice analysis comparing Sinjelic's voice in the recording with his authenticated voice from earlier Skype videos confirmed that the speaker was indeed Sinjelic. Crucially, the audio quality and the balance suggested the recording device was on Velimorovic's phone, consistent with the prosecutor's claim that he was already a police informant by that time who recorded the conversation voluntarily. In a second leaked call between Sinjelic and Bratislav Dikic, a former chief of Serbia's special police, whom Sinjelic had recruited himself, Dikic complained about being unable to reach someone whose phone was in roaming mode. They discussed waiting for election results and explicitly referenced the Russians and the politicians who appeared to be part of the plan themselves. Later, as the court case was underway in Montenegro, more was revealed that allowed us to see how Montenegro's authorities had worked to turn the conspiracy against itself. 4 to 5 days before the election, the Montenegrin accomplice Velimorovic had surrendered and become a police informant. Why exactly he did that, I'm not sure. But when Shishmakov, one of the Russians running the operation, requested photographic proof that weapons had been acquired, Montenegrin police borrowed weapons from their own armory to stage a convincing photograph that was then sent on to the Russian operative. Sensing that something was wrong, Sinjelic, the Serbian accomplice, decided at the last moment to replace Velimorovich with Dikic, another Serbian accomplice, as the key field organizer. When Dikic went to the safe house where he was told weapons were stored, Montenegro police were waiting and detained him. By election day, with key conspirators already in custody, the plot was effectively neutralized. As if we needed more evidence that Shishmakov and Moiseev were members of the GRU, they were somehow able to get themselves out of Serb custody even before their arrest had been made public. Travel records show that at 4 a.m. on October 22nd, just 8 days after the attempted coup was scheduled to take place, and 2 days before the Serbian police even announced the arrest of these two Russian nationals, Shishmakov and Moiseev were flown back to Moscow. Both tickets were bought at midnight on the 22nd, just hours before they flew off. The hasty departure reeks of a state-negotiated extradition. We may never be sure what the Russians used to get the Serbians to agree to quickly release the two men, but it is yet another validation that they were not just rogue operators, despite Russia's claim to the contrary in the following days. In addition, we later uncovered evidence that the broader Russian state and key oligarchs were also involved in this attempt to influence Montenegro's political direction. Through leaked emails obtained by Ukrainian hacktivist groups, we discovered that Konstantin Malofeev, the Russian oligarch who had funded the initial invasion of Crimea and Donbass in Russia in 2014, was also deeply involved in Montenegro. Alexander Usovsky, who had freelanced for Malofeev's active measures in Central and Eastern Europe for a couple of years, sent a telling email to Malofeev's associate Alona Starokina on November 28, 2016. In it, he referred to the unnecessary Montenegro fiasco and explicitly stated his belief that Malofeev was behind it. He even proposed a new initiative to wash the egg off the face following the Montenegro failure. Malofeev had been actively supporting Montenegro's anti-NATO opposition for years. In September 2014, he even hosted Strahinja Bulajic, Montenegrin MP known for anti-NATO positions. Bulajic later became a leader of the Democratic Front coalition. During the preceding 2 years, Malofeev's TV station Tsargrad TV had given extensive coverage to Democratic Front leaders Andrija Mandic and Milan Knežević, both later identified as suspects in the coup plot. And during a February 2016 interview, Mandic predicted perpetual street protests and violent conflicts if there was no referendum on NATO membership, and claimed that he had been promised Russian support during a meeting with Duma Speaker Sergei Naryshkin, who later became the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. The investigation also revealed involvement by RIS, RISS, the Kremlin-owned Russian Institute of Strategic Studies. In February 2016, RIS Balkan Desk Chief Nikola Bondarev had published an analysis that chillingly predicted the exact scenario described in the coup plot. Crowds of protesters will attempt to storm the parliament, police would disperse them with rubber bullets, and protesters will persist against Djukanovic and take over parliament. Bondarev wrote then, the process of protest activity in Montenegro must move to a different stage. Currently, we see peaceful protests, but they may escalate into something similar to what happened in Kiev on the Maidan. RISS Chairman General Leonid Reshetnikov, my biggest fan, had been an outspoken critic of Prime Minister Djukanovic for years, at one point calling him a traitor who will answer for his treachery to Russia on Judgment Day, and repeatedly predicted an anti-Western rebellion if Djukanovic won the election. Despite all of this, however, Moscow's official line remained that the operation had been done by a set of rogue individuals. Our investigation into the Montenegro coup plot revealed a sophisticated, multi-layered Russian operation that went far beyond the two GRU operatives arrested in Serbia. It demonstrated how Unit Tuna Wi-Fi 5 and other Russian intelligence services coordinate with oligarchs, with think tanks, with opposition leaders abroad, religious institutions to create deniable networks for political interference. The pattern we uncovered in Montenegro, using intelligence operatives, recruiting local assets with compromised backgrounds, coordinating through encrypted communication and maintaining plausible deniability through oligarch proxies, would become a template for Russian interference operations across Europe and the world. The Montenegro coup attempt failed, and the country successfully joined NATO in 2017. But similar techniques and networks we uncovered in the investigation would surface again in other Russian operations across Europe, from influence operations in Moldova to political sabotage in Catalonia. Subscribe now to the Christo Files so you don't miss other episodes like this one. And let us know in the comments if there are other episodes and events around the world that you would like us to focus on.